Welcome back to the Panic Room, everyone, for another book review. Now, if you watched my vlog for this book, you know that when I say that this book is special, it actually is. So to give you the 100 words or less backstory, my boyfriend's mom flips houses, and she actually found this book in one of those houses. And it's awesome because it's like a collector's special edition kind of deal. If you want a closer look at everything that came with this book, check out my vlog. I went a lot slower and kind of went through the little case, but I will show you guys because it's a lot easier to see the title on the outside case. But the book today is The Everlasting by Tim Levin. And guys, yes, this is a metal case. It's awesome. I mean, come on. Of course she thought it was horror. Look at that, right? Anybody would think it's horror. Now, you might be wondering, why do you keep saying that, Pax? Is it not horror? In the strictest definition, no. I wouldn't call this horror. I would call this fantasy with like horror sprinkles. It definitely had some horror-esque elements. It definitely did. I would say primarily this was more of a fantasy to me. I do think that it had some very like bleak moments, and it is very philosophical and moral in a lot of ways. I said in my vlog that I think that this is a very quotable book because our main character, Scott, has a really big tendency to be introspective and reflective a lot, and you get these wonderful like internal monologues from him because of that characteristic. And I'm okay with that. Now, I realize that's not the case for everyone, so keep that in mind. I will also say that I'm pretty sure, again, I don't do a whole lot of like research. I want you guys to get my absolute raw opinion. I'm pretty sure this must be a series. I think this might be book one. I just get the feeling. Now, that's not to say, I feel like this can stand on its own. And I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I'm not going to seek out probably any more of this series. I like my fantasy, I do. I'm too big of a nerd not to like fantasy. It's just not what I gravitate to. I have to be in the mood for fantasy. What do they call it on book 2? Mood reading? I have to be in the mood for a fantasy. Plus, not to mention, my favorite book series of all time is a fantasy. So, as terrible as this sounds, I find it hard to live up to that book series. So I just don't bother reading fantasy because my favorite book series of all time, the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind, that's fantasy, and to me, that is the height of fantasy, and it just isn't going to get any better than that. So, but that's a me thing, right? If you like fantasy, I know there's some of you out there that do. This is awesome. It had some great horror-esque moments. You might want to give it a shot. It's real thin. It didn't take me any time at all to read this. And, you know, oh, and can we just check out the cover? Yeah, that's pretty cool, right? It took till about halfway through the book for this to make sense, though. So this is largely going to be spoiler-free because of the way this is written. And I really think that that is kind of a characteristic of fantasy, maybe, because for me, fantasy is more about the journey rather than like the shit that happens. More often than not. I'm not saying that like what happens isn't important, but for fantasy, I feel like the journey should be like the point, right? And that was really the case here. So I already said we had our main character, Scott. And Scott is in his mid-40s, and there's a lot of crazy shit that happens to this man, so I understand, like, some of the parts where he's just like, I don't know what to do, but there were points here that I was like, you are not the brightest bulb. So we kind of get hit in the face right away with our action. You know, there's a lot to do with, like, other planes, ghosts, kind of, more actually, wraiths are probably a better term for that. It's something like if a zombie and a ghost had a baby. That's what you have in this book. But there's a lot of talk about, you know, different planes of existence. There's some immortal characters in this book. Again, harkening back to more fantasy for me. However, there is some gory parts. There's some gory parts. For example, the best gory part right here, this guy, this is Tigre. All right, he is one of your immortals. Yeah, and let me just give you, this is why I say this has horror elements. This guy, because none of the immortals in this book want to be immortal, you've seen that whole trope, right? Like, oh, living forever is awful. This is one of those guys, except he has spent his immortality, because it doesn't really give you an actual age, it just says that they're super, super old, but he has spent his immortality, like, trying to die. So if you look real close, he's like covered in scars and stuff. Sorry about the glare, guys. It's super shiny. he's like covered in scars and things because like people will like have wars. Like he'll even start wars just so that he can like go get his throat slashed. Stuff like that. And he's super gory. You know, he does shit in the book, you know, like killing people and things like that. There is a car crash scene that is incredibly gory. But I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in the vlog. To me, a lot of the horror elements here are in its bleakness. Because you have our main character, Scott, trying to deal with all this stuff that's happening. He is essentially on this quest to save his wife. Now, let's pause here. I am not a big fan of romance in my books. Just not. This was warranted. Scott needed motivation. Alright? He was your, what do they call it, like, unlikely hero. So, we had to give him some motivation to get up and get going. And his wife getting taken into one of these, like, death realms, that was his motivation. So, I got it. However, you get these flashbacks to the other big player here, his grandfather, Papa, who is dead. But that doesn't really mean anything. I mean, we're dealing with, like, dead realms. You know, it doesn't really matter. So you get these flashbacks to his Papa, and, you know, and Scott's like 9 or 15 or whatever, and his Papa died when he was 16. After he murdered a man, he unalived himself. And so it's kind of this, like, why? And you find this big mystical reason because apparently they found something called the Court of Souls, which is where he gets involved with these immortals because they're the ones that wrote it. And the whole story is him trying to quest for this Court of Souls in order to trade it for his wife. And of course, antics ensue. I will say that the highlights for this book for me were, you know, Scott having to go into like these ancient ruins. There's a really awesome, oh, so awesome. At the end when he goes into like, it's never really said, like the Court of Souls is thought to be like a book, right? Because at one point they talk about tablets and of course the immortals wrote it. But then at the end he's like going into this house and he has to kind of like go through it. It's like this big maze and stuff. And it's like the house is the Court of Souls. I feel like you get what I'm saying. And, oh, but the house. Oh, it's like a haunted house lover's dream. And there are these things called screaming skulls. It's so cool. I mean, it's exactly what you're thinking too. It's exactly what you're thinking. And the way they describe them with like the flesh hanging off. Again, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's not really what you would call a horror book, but it's got some awesome horror elements to it. It really does. And I'm telling you, second time I've mentioned it, that car crash scene, that was something. If nothing else, just like its effect on Scott. That was like, whew, that was kind of heavy, you know? There's a lot, if you like ghosts and things like that, there was a lot of like kind of interesting talk about that. About how like the death realm and the life realm come together and, you know, what does it mean to have a life? Because now that Scott knows all this shit is real, you know, he's starting to second guess everything in his life. You know, it's very, philosophical in that regard, you know, because at one point he even talks about, he's like, you know, we're all just spiraling towards death. Does anything really matter? You know, and like I said, it's very bleak in a lot of ways. And I feel like that too lends itself to it being kind of like a horror book. I'm not going to ruin anything about it in case you do want to check it out. I feel like you know kind of what happens with Scott at the end, since it is a fantasy novel. I will say that the highlights were, for me, the more horror-esque elements. The details of the death realm were awesome. The screaming skulls and their house was easily my favorite. Really, overall, it was a cool story. It was a good, like, fantasy-esque journey. And I will still say, towards the end, it felt like Super Ghouls and Ghosts, the video game. Like, you just felt that quest, you know? Like, in the back of my mind, I was hearing, like, the Indiana Jones music, like, da-da-da. Like, we gotta get there, you know? And there's even one point where, like, Scott's, like, having to move spider webs, you know? Tell me you haven't seen that. Tell me you haven't seen that in some kind of, like, 80s action movie. You know what I'm talking about, right? Actually, you know what I thought? Do you remember when Indiana Jones, I believe it was in The Last Crusade, when he's going into the, like, cave thing, after they shot his dad and he has to get the, Holy Grail. It's been too long. And he, like, has to move, he moves that big spider web. That's what I thought of. The way that scene is written in this book, I swear to God, it could have been that. I feel like if you've seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, guys, this was awesome. You know, it was a found book. How often does that happen, right? And even though I know I'm talking to a group of primarily horror lovers, I do feel like that sometimes fantasy and horror does overlap, and it can be done well. This was pretty good. Was it the best fantasy I've ever read? No. But I'm kind of a harsh critic when it comes to fantasy, and I know that. I loved the horror-esque elements, and this was a good story. It was a good story. It's thin. If you're looking for just a cool, like, you know, I want to get out of my head kind of book, this does the trick. It really does. And again, it had some really awesome, like, philosophical and moral conundrums going on that I enjoyed. If you like that in your book, you might really like that. It was one of the, like, strongest parts. But guys, thank you for coming back to another review in the Panic Room. Please give me a like, hit subscribe. It would really help me out. And until next time, bye for now.